I am Dr. Sunil Sawant, Professor and Head, Kishanveer Mahavidyalaya, Y, Department of English of this college. The topic of my presentation is Matthew Arnold's touchstone method. Now, Matthew Arnold, the 19th century poet as well as critic, writing in the tradition of English literature, he was a very important poet of this Victorian period. At the same time, he wrote some of the important critical essays. One of them was the study of poetry. And he proposes this concept of touchstone method, critical method, in his essay, The Study of Poetry. Now, in this essay at the beginning, he claims that poetry can now substitute a religion. He says the strongest part of our religion today is its unconscious poetry. And while justifying this claim that poetry is going to replace religion in our times, he puts forth the concept of touchstone method. Now, this touchstone method is nothing but a comparative method of literary criticism. According to this method, in order to judge a work of poetry, what you have to do is this, that you have to compare passages taken from works of great masters of poetry with the poem you want to criticize, you want to discuss. So you have to take some modern poem and compare this poem with different passages chosen from the tradition of poetry. And for Arnold, even a single line, a single selected quotation can become the touchstone. If the other work moves us in the same way as these lines and expressions do, then this work, this modern day poetic work, is really a great work, otherwise not. So this is the touchstone method. If the modern poem succeeds in moving us in the same way, the way the lines or expressions from Shakespeare or from some great author of the past, if they move us, if this modern work moves us in the same way, then it can be called great work. Now, Arnold is against false kind of criticism or false kind of evaluation, and he especially talks about two types of criticism: the historic kind of criticism and the personal kind of criticism. And he differentiates these two types of criticism, historic and personal, with what he called real kind of criticism, real estimate. The term used by him is estimate. If you want to know whether any poetic work is of high quality, we should compare this work with specimens, with lines of poetry of the highest quality. This is the idea of touchstone method. According to Matthew Arnold, the most useful method of discovering the worth of poetry, the value of poetry, is to have always in one's mind lines and expressions of the great masters and to apply them as a touchstone to other poetry. So this is a very important method of criticism suggested by Matthew Arnold, that instead of judging some author in a vacuum, what you have to do, you have to find out the tradition of poetry. You have to study the tradition of poetry, and by comparing this modern day poet with the poets of the past, you can understand the real value of this modern day poet. The real classics can serve as the touchstones by which the merit of contemporary poetic work can be tested. Arnold was basically a classicist. He admired the ancient Greek and Roman authors as the models to be followed by the modern English authors. And his touchstone method is in line with this insistence on following the ancient Greek and Roman models. The English masters like Shakespeare, Spenser, or Milton, they can also be taken as models like Greek and Roman models. And the touchstone method is the method where we select some passages from modern authors, and then we compare these selected passages with the passages from the classics, and thereby we decide the merits of modern day poetry. Now, what are the limitations of Arnold's touchstone method? Now, Arnold would probably have agreed that his method of comparing passage with a passage is not a sufficient test for determining the value of a work as a whole. You cannot judge the value of the entire play or entire novel by applying a single line from Shakespeare or from some great author. Arnold himself insisted that we must judge a poem by the total impression and not by its fragments. So Arnold contradicts himself here, because he himself wanted that total impression should be taken into consideration while judging the value of the poem, and we cannot judge some poem by applying a single line or a single passage. Arnold seems to go too far, insisting all the time on work of the highest excellence in literature. As we know, literature does not contain all the time serious works. We have comic works, we have farces, we have humorous works, but Arnold insists on serious kind of poetry, and it is not fair to demand that all hills should be Alps. All hills cannot be Alps or Himalayas. Okay? There may be an excellence in some minor poetry worthwhile on its own account. So even so-called minor poetry may have flashes of greatness in them. Arnold expresses the view that good literature will never lose its currency. There might be some vulgarization and cheapening of literary values as a result of the increase in numbers of the common sort of readers, but the currency of good literature is ensured by the instinct of self-preservation in humanity. Arnold's faith in the value of poetry of the highest kind is very strong, and that's why he recommends the use of lines from great poetry. He declared that it would be much better to disregard the mass of current literature. By his method, we can set apart the alive, the vital, and the sincere from what is shoddy, showy, and the insincere in the history of literature. Arnold declared in poetry, it is the glory, the eternal honor that charlatanism shall find no entrance. So Arnold is very much concerned with preserving the serious kind of literature, and therefore he gives us this touchstone method. Thank you very much.